All right, hello again, everybody. We are back for section 11 of Comparative Criminology. And this section, we're going to talk about environmental crime. And I know what some of you are thinking. How can the environment commit crimes? No, this is about humans committing crimes that kind of has to do with or surrounds environmental issues, right? Just some examples. There are many, many, many more than this. But these are some of the more common ones. Poaching, especially problematic in big game regions in places like Africa, but also an issue in other places, South America, even North America. They have a problem with poaching of things like moose and deer in certain areas. Then there's trafficking in endangered species. There's high demand for endangered species in many places in the world. And so people will kind of steal those from the place where they're found naturally and try to take them to the places where they can be sold. There's illegal logging. Forests are a renewable resource, but sometimes the time scale needed for renewing it is on the hundreds or thousands of years. And so there are certain areas of forests that are protected because replacing them would take hundreds or thousands of years. But that timber is usually worth a lot of money. So many times they're illegally cut down anyway. And then one of the biggest ones, dumping waste, right? In the 21st century, we generate tons and tons and tons and tons of trash of all kinds every day, from plastic waste to food waste, to scrap metal, to nuclear waste, and chemical waste. And there are laws in many places around where you can kind of dispose of those, or the healthy and legal way to dispose of those, but that usually costs money. So many times companies or even individuals want to get rid of it more cheaply, so they dump it illegally. And we're going to get a lot more into a lot of this, but many criminologists have kind of argued about whether environmental crime has different causes and theories of criminality than traditional crime. So is the kind of the historical and social context of assault and theft and burglary and all those traditional crimes, are those the same or even similar to the causes of environmental crime? And there's I think there's much argument about this. My personal opinion is that environmental crime is indeed having at least moderately different kind of causes and theories behind why someone would commit environmental crime as compared to more traditional kinds of crime. The other thing, one of the reasons that makes me believe that, and another thing I should point out, is that in many, many cases, environmental crimes is less about breaking the law and more about making the law. So, for instance, if a country doesn't have a law against dumping used motor oil in the ocean, that's going to be a much more common practice than it is if it was about breaking the law. And they can make a lot of money in that area importing motor oil from other countries and then just dumping it in the ocean. So in many cases, it's not necessarily a criminal act that we're talking about. It's a lack of a law preventing this act that should be criminal or is criminal in other places that causes these environmental crimes to take place and be accepted and be more commonplace than they would be otherwise. Now, wildlife crime. Okay, wildlife crime are things like poaching and trafficking in endangered animals and all those things. And there's three kind of different levels when it comes to wildlife crime. The bottom one is micro. That's individual acts. This is things like cruelty to animals. Somebody neglects their pets, or somebody who tortures a squirrel that they caught, or the acts on the individual level. There's the meso level, which is kind of regional, right? This is not necessarily individual acts, but there's not necessarily international either. So these are things like puppy mills, right? Puppy mills are places where dogs are forced to breed in usually very squalid conditions, and they're just trying to get as many puppies out as you can because those puppies can be sold. You know, some of these puppy mills are, you know, disturbing and disgusting, but make a lot of money for their owners by selling puppies around for pets, essentially. And then there's the macro level, which is the international level, which is, you know, things like trafficking in pangolins or rhino horn, or you know, that kind of smuggling from areas where the animals are to the areas where people want them. And it's either the animal itself or it's a piece of the animal, such as the skin or the horn, or the, you know, some piece of the animal, if not the whole thing. Now, what are kind of the end goals of wildlife crime? Excuse me. Well, depending on what animal you're talking about, it can be very different. But these products from animals are made into furniture, and especially wood, which I realize isn't really wildlife, but it's alive and it's wild, so dang it, I'm going to count it. There are rare and expensive woods that can be illegally taken to turn into furniture, but also things like, you know, chairs with antlers for handles and things like that. There's jewelry. There are lots of pieces of animal remains that are commonly used as jewelry, either ivory or rhino horn or turtle shell. Things like that are commonly turned into different jewelry products. Fashion, i.e. Snake skin boots or alligator skin boots, is one example. Cosmetics or perfume. There are still places in the world where animal products that are usually deemed to be illegal to take or consume are illegally put into cosmetics and perfume. And then maybe one of the worst offenders is medicine, and that's in quotes because it's not actual medicine. But there are still places in the world, notably Southeast Asia, where people believe that certain animal products will provide certain medicinal benefits. And this is completely debunked by science, but it doesn't matter. That's their cultural belief, is that these things work. And so there's continually a market for these products, and we'll talk about one example here in a minute. Zoos or pets, like zoos around the world traffic in endangered species because they really want an endangered species, because that will be seen as a big draw for tourists and other people to come to their zoo. Hopefully, this is fairly rare in you know, kind of modern Western democracies, but I have the feeling, without looking too deeply into it, that it's not as rare as we would hope. But it's definitely not as rare as we would hope in other parts of the world, where, you know, it's not necessarily a modern industrialized democracy. Also for pets, if rich people really want a tiger for a pet, they're going to get a tiger for a pet. In fact, I believe I read somewhere that there are more tigers alive as pets in the state of Texas than there are wild tigers in their natural habitat. Like, that is fairly ridiculous. Like, just in the state of Texas, there are more captive pet tigers than there are wild tigers where they actually come from. And then finally, for food, right? There are certain people who want to eat endangered species, or even less endangered but protected species for food. There are a few Scandinavian countries and Asian countries that are still hunting whales, for instance. Even though they're protected by international law, there are a few countries that still hunt whales for food, and luckily it's a lot more rare now than it was 100, 150 years ago, but it does still happen. Now, what's astonishing, and what was astonishing to me at least, was wildlife goods is the second most profitable illegal market in the world. It's only behind illegal drugs, right? So like drugs, you make this much money, but only second place behind it is wildlife crime, transporting rhino horn and ivory and pangolins and tiger skins and all these different products is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly popular. One of the reasons why it still happens is because in many of these countries, even if they've outlawed the hunting or the capture of certain animals or certain, even logging of trees, they hire people to protect those areas and police those areas, but those people are often very, very poorly paid. And because this is the second most profitable illegal market, the people who want to poach a tiger are going to be they're going to have plenty of money with which to bribe the underpaid wildlife guard who's supposed to protect those tigers. So the bad guys essentially in many, many, many cases have tons and tons of money with which to bribe people, and the people who are supposed to be protecting these resources are completely underpaid and desperate in many cases for money. So it's not nearly as difficult for illegal wildlife crime to happen as we would hope, based on this kind of lack of resources for the good guys and excess in resources for the bad guys. Now, one example of kind of very, in my mind, intensely cruel wildlife crime is rhino horn. Now, rhino horn is one of the things we were talking about earlier, where it's turned into a medicine. So there will be illegal poachers who will go and they will kill rhinos and then cut off their horn, and that's the only piece they take. They leave the rest of the animal dead and missing its horn. So the majority of this happens in South Africa. And then those rhino horns are smuggled through usually the Middle East or Eastern Europe, and then it ends up in Asia, which is where the vast majority of seizures take place, because that's where the customers are. That's where the people who are going to buy the rhino horn are. So all three of those areas, they have different processes happening, and they need to be policed in different ways, and they have different barriers to effective policing, to the point where this is still, to this day, a very much more common than you would hope type of crime. I heard a few years ago, and I really, really hope this is true, that some researcher in Asia had developed completely synthetic rhino horn. I don't know what it's made from, but it's completely fake, but it's indistinguishable from the real thing. And their intent was to mass market it and flood the market with it, completely destroying the market for real rhino horn. So the poaching in South Africa and Southern Africa will stop. So let's hope that happens. Now, the last piece of wildlife crime we're going to talk about is ivory. Ivory is kind of a special case. It's not quite bone. Not quite. Rhino horn is made of keratin, which is the same thing that like human hair and fingernails is made of. Ivory is kind of different from both. Ivory comes from the tusks of elephants, and elephants. I believe only male elephants, but maybe in some species of elephant it's males and females. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they grow throughout the elephant's life, and kind of the bigger the elephant, the bigger the tusks, means the older he is. And ivory has been used for lots of things for hundreds of years. The reason that piano keys are are called ivories is because they used to be made of ivory. They would take elephant ivory and carve it down into the keys for a piano. It's also used in things like jewelry, decorative items, all kinds of stuff. But because elephant populations are critically endangered in many cases, especially in kind of the late 20th century, early 21st century, elephants have been protected, which means that poachers have been kind of smuggling ivory, killing elephants, taking the ivory, and smuggling it for numerous purposes. And that's been illegal for a long time. But interestingly, kind of via international law, or at least here in the United States, there's an exception in the law where you can still buy and sell ivory as long as it's worked, which means it's not just an ivory tusk like you would see in that picture, i.e. it's in its end product, a piece of jewelry or a piano or something like that, from pre-1947. So if somebody acquired the ivory prior to 1947 and turned it into some product, you are still legally allowed to buy and sell that product. The problem is, how do you tell whether it's from pre-1947 or whether it's from 1997? In a lot of cases, it's very, very difficult. So that exception is kind of often used to kind of smuggle modern ivory by making it look or at least seem like older ivory than it actually is. All right, that's the end of wildlife crime. We'll be back in just a second and we'll talk more about environmental crimes. See you in a minute.